In late May 1945, after the radios had begun calling the war in Europe over, Private Keller still drove as if any bend could kill him. The surrender had ended campaigns, not hazards. Roads were cratered, bridges were patched, and every village still held men with weapons and reasons to hate. His convoy had a slot to make between two military police checkpoints on a supply route that ran from the forward areas to the rear, and his sergeant's rule was simple: do not turn a transport into an incident. The result was tunnel vision, eyes on craters, ditches, and hedgerows. The cost was that anything behind him became, by habit, something he would explain away. The route they used had been built by necessity. Engineers and quartermasters had stitched a line of road signs, fuel points, and traffic control posts through northern France so trucks could move without clogging towns or colliding in the dark. Military police guarded key junctions and kept a ledger of what passed: convoys, ambulances, prisoner loads. Keller had already been stopped once that morning, told to keep his distance from the truck ahead, warned not to block the lane if he broke down. The result was that he understood time as permission, not as comfort. The cost was that he felt watched even when no one was watching. At the last junction, a military policeman had stepped into the lane with a clipboard and a pencil worn down to a nub. He had not asked Keller what he carried in his heart. He had asked for counts: how many prisoners, what destination, which unit. The sergeant answered in the short voice of men who had done this too many times: numbers, not names. The policeman wrote, nodded, and waved them through as if moving cattle. The result was passage down the road without argument. The cost was the way Keller absorbed the lesson. If the road was a machine, then stopping it meant you were the fault. He drove a 2.5-ton 6x6 truck, a GMC-CCKW, with a canvas-covered bed and metal rings that clinked when the springs slapped over potholes. On forward runs, it hauled crates. On empty return runs, it hauled whatever needed to move back, because no one had spare vehicles dedicated to moving people. Keller had heard the logic explained in briefings. Prisoners were collected, counted, and passed rearward so front units could keep moving, and empty trucks were the easiest container for bodies that were suddenly the rear's responsibility. The result of that chain was speed. The cost was that the chain cared about totals, not individuals, and it made stopping feel like sabotage. 17 women sat in the covered bed, wrists bound, boots muddy from a march that ended at a collection point behind a torn hedge line. Their clothing was a patchwork: civilian coats over scraps of uniform, scarves where helmets should have been, one armband half ripped away, evidence of a late-war world that had thrown everyone into roles that were never clean. Keller had been told only the count and the destination, an enclosure at a crossroads where military police would take custody and send them farther back. The result was that he tried to see them as a tally to protect himself from thinking about what each face meant. The cost was that he also trained himself not to listen too closely. He rode with his sergeant in the cab and another truck behind, and the sergeant filled quiet stretches with reminders. Do not unfasten restraints. Do not hand out food. Do not stop unless ordered. Keller nodded, because nodding cost nothing. The result was obedience that kept him safe from immediate blame. The cost was that obedience became a reflex that could outpace judgment. The first tap reached him as a dull knock through the cab's back panel when the truck dropped into a rut and climbed out. He glanced at the canvas ripple and told himself it was road and hardware. The metal bed rings always made a small storm of sound, and the canvas always shifted like skin. The result was that he stayed on the throttle. The cost was 2 minutes that did not feel like 2 minutes yet. Then the tapping came again, spaced like a fist on wood, not like equipment bouncing. Keller flicked his eyes to the mirror and saw only dust and the blur of vehicles behind him. He had heard enough stories: prisoners faking illness, prisoners using a stop to scatter into hedgerows, escorts punished for losing control. That suspicion rose first. The result was delay disguised as caution. The cost was that he began building excuses inside his own head. He tried to convert sound into a problem he could solve with distance. If he kept moving, the war would keep moving behind him, and the prisoners would become someone else's ledger entry at the next checkpoint. The result was temporary calm. The cost was the way his throat tightened, because calm arrived only by refusing to acknowledge what the tapping might be. The tapping turned into rapid pounding, and between blows he caught a strangled English word, "Help." The syllable landed in his chest as if thrown through the canvas. He heard it again, then a cough that ended in a wet gasp. The result was that suspicion cracked. The cost was that he now knew he had been guessing wrong while time leaked away. Keller leaned toward the sergeant and reported the word, not just the noise. The sergeant's face hardened. He hated uncertainty more than he hated delay. He ordered Keller to pull over at the next widening where the convoy could half-mount the shoulder without blocking traffic. The result was an order that sounded responsible. The cost was that the next widening was still a stretch away, and Keller felt every yard as if it were debt. At the widening near a flooded ditch, Keller braked and threw the truck into neutral. The convoy stacked behind him. Exhaust settled into the wet air. The sergeant jumped down, scanning hedgerows by reflex, and ordered Keller to check the bed while he watched the line. Keller ran along the side, detouring around a puddle that stole seconds and made him curse. The result was that he reached the rear later than his legs wanted. The cost was the first taste of panic, hot and metallic. He yanked the flap up and stale air spilled out, sweat, breath, and something sharp. A thin, dark-haired woman had raw wrists from pounding. She stabbed a finger toward a body slumped in the corner. Keller saw a young woman, eyes half-lidded, skin waxy, lips cracked. The dark-haired woman pulled up her shirt and exposed a swollen lower belly, red and shiny with fever. The result was instant clarity. This was not a trick. The cost was shame that rose hotter than fear, because Keller heard his own earlier suspicion echoing in his ears. The sergeant climbed up beside him, took one look, and swore. He barked at the dark-haired woman to keep her hands visible, then snapped at Keller to run for a doctor. Keller hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring at the fevered skin, as if his eyes could rewind time. The result was an extra heartbeat that Keller would remember. The cost was that the heartbeat became part of the 3 minutes he would later count. Keller ran. He sprinted down the muddy road toward a junction where he had seen a jeep and medical crates, laces coming loose, lungs burning, voice tearing as he shouted for a doctor. Trucks rumbled past on the main lane, drivers honking in irritation at the halted convoy. Keller ignored them. The result was speed bought with desperation. The cost was that every breath carried one question. If you had stopped earlier, would you be running like this now? Captain Morrison had just stepped from a jeep near stacked medical boxes when Keller nearly collided with him. Morrison's sleeves were damp, his face tight with fatigue, his eyes sharp in the way surgeons' eyes were sharp even when they were tired. Keller got out 3 facts: truck, woman, dying, and Morrison did not ask for more. He grabbed his bag and followed Keller back at a trot that made his boots slap the road. The result was motion without debate. The cost was that Keller realized he could not tell Morrison the patient's name because he had never asked. They reached the truck with Keller's chest on fire and Morrison breathing hard. Morrison climbed into the bed, pressed fingers into the swollen abdomen with a grim efficiency, and snapped orders that turned panic into a plan. Clear the truck, now! The women were forced down into the mud, shaking and loud with fear. Keller's job became a gate, hands up, rifle slung, body blocking the opening, while one prisoner clutched his sleeve and spilled German he could not understand. The result was that the bed emptied. The cost was that every second spent on order was a second stolen from tissue that might already be failing. Morrison worked with what he had. He asked for more light. Someone held a lamp or a flashlight near the opening, and the beam jittered with shaking hands. Instruments clinked into a metal tray. A hemostat clicked shut. Canvas muffled the doctor's short commands into low, urgent syllables. Keller heard the snap of a wartime morphine syringe being opened, then the patient's breathing change, slower, heavier. The result was that the covered bed became a small, brutal world where the war's end did not matter. The cost was that Keller, posted at the opening, could only listen and imagine the parts he could not see. He lit cigarette after cigarette with shaking fingers, breaking matches, counting time by drags. Smoke did not calm him. It gave his mouth something to do besides confess. Once, the metal sound stopped, and for 2 heartbeats there was only the engine's low idle and the distant call of a military policeman directing traffic. Then Morrison's tone sharpened, instruments resumed faster, and Keller felt his shoulders rise as if bracing for impact. The result was the sense of near failure. The cost was the certainty that if she died, the tapping would harden into a lifelong sentence. Minutes later, Morrison stepped out, sweat dark at his collar, hands stained, and told the lieutenant who had arrived flatly, "She's alive." Keller heard it, and something inside him loosened. His cigarette slipped into a puddle and died with a hiss. The result was relief that felt physical. The cost was that relief made the earlier minutes burn brighter, because now there had been something real to lose. Keller did not climb in to see the woman's face. He told himself she was the doctor's patient now, that his job was to get the convoy moving, that staring would help nothing. He folded canvas, picked up torn bandage wrappers, and acted competent. The result was that the chain resumed. The cost was that he passed by, the only moment she might have opened her eyes and seen him, the only moment she might have become more than a sound. The women were loaded back in, quieter now, fear altered by what they had witnessed. The sergeant pushed Keller toward the cab. Military police were expecting a count before dark, and a count was how disasters became paperwork. Keller drove, hands steady again, and tried to summon the woman's face, but he could recall only pale skin, the red swelling, and the sound of fists on wood. The result was movement forward. The cost was a blank where a name should have been. At the checkpoint enclosure, military police took custody with clipped professionalism. They counted heads, wrote numbers, and waved the convoy on, already dealing with the next load arriving behind. Keller watched the women disappear through wire as if through a curtain. The result was transfer completed. The cost was that the transfer severed his last chance to ask anyone, even badly, who the sick woman was. That night, under a dim lamp in a tent that smelled of wet wool and fuel, Keller wrote one line in his marching notebook. Convoy stopped once. 1 female prisoner sick. Doc treated. He stared at the ink, then closed the book, as if closing a door. The result was a record that made the day look ordinary. The cost was that the record was too thin to hold the weight he felt, and it would be all he had. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this, ground-level moments where history turns on a few minutes, hit like and follow. It helps keep these accounts alive. Now, back to Keller. For 30 years, Keller did not speak of the tapping. He married, farmed, fixed machinery, raised children, and learned to smile in photographs the way people expected a returned soldier to smile. When noises startled him, a hammer on a post, a child's knuckles on a door, he told himself it was nothing and moved on. The result was a life that looked steady. The cost was a private loop in his head that never finished. He tried, at times, to bury the loop under work. He rose before dawn, repaired fences, and drove tractors through fields that turned to mud in spring. The physical labor gave his body honest fatigue. The result was sleep that sometimes came. The cost was that when it did not, he lay awake listening for a sound that was never there. In November 1975, at a Thanksgiving table in Ohio, his son asked, "Dad, did you ever save anyone over there?" Keller set his knife down carefully so it would not clatter. He stared at his hands, rough and scarred, and heard French mud in his memory as clearly as if it were under the table. After a long silence, he said, quietly, "I almost killed someone." The result was that the room went still. The cost was that his family was now inside the story with him. He told it in plain sentences and let the plainness do the damage. A truck, prisoners, knocking, a delay. A doctor operating in the back of the truck. A woman who lived. He thought she lived, because the doctor had said so. He admitted he never learned her name and never asked what became of her after the military police took custody. The result was confession without comfort. The cost was his son's next question, because sons still want endings. Then what happened to her? Keller said, "I don't know." His wife's napkin slipped and fell to the floor. No one moved to pick it up. The result was a gap that could not be ignored. The cost was that Keller understood the gap was partly his doing, and he could feel the weight of that understanding settle into the rest of the evening. That night he went to the basement and found the notebook. The page held only that one thin line. The result was proof that existed and still failed him. The cost was the realization that in 1945 he had chosen distance, no name, no face, and now he lived inside that choice. He wrote to the Veterans Office that handled records, giving his unit, month, and the fact of a prisoner transport where a female prisoner required emergency abdominal surgery. He wrote as if asking for a document, but he felt as if asking for absolution. Weeks later, a reply arrived with careful language. Individual prisoner information could not be released. Correspondence could be forwarded only through approved channels if an identity could be confirmed. The result was a door that opened a crack. The cost was that the crack did not include the one thing he needed first, her name. Keller learned how a bureaucracy can turn urgency into calendar time. He filled forms that ask for service numbers and dates more than stories. He waited while his request was routed, stamped, and placed into piles that belonged to people who had never heard knocking through canvas. The result was process. The cost was that process made him relive the same mistake, waiting under a different name. He tried the only other name he had, Morrison. Keller requested the doctor's service record, hoping for a unit assignment that might lead him to field hospital logs. The reply he received was a short notice that Morrison had died years earlier. The result was a dead end that removed the one witness Keller had relied on at the time. The cost was a new loneliness. The man who had said she's alive was gone, and Keller was left arguing with a voice that no longer existed. He tried to rebuild the day anyway. He dug out maps, traced where his unit had been, and wrote down every crossroads he could remember. He called one old comrade whose number he found through a reunion list. The comrade remembered Morrison operating in a truck and remembered the convoy being late to a military police point, but he did not remember the prisoner's name either. The result was shared memory without resolution. The cost was the confirmation that Keller's failure was ordinary, which made it harder to treat as a fluke. The search became background noise for years, letters, dead ends, polite refusals. Some officers did not reply. Others replied with generalities. One sent Keller a generic description of how prisoners were collected, counted, and moved rearward along supply routes, often on empty returning trucks, handed off again and again so front units could keep moving. Keller read it with a bitter clarity. He had been a cog, and cogs did not get to keep names. The result was a framework that matched his memory. The cost was a new anger, not at the system itself, but at how willingly he had let the system define his responsibility. His wife watched him change. He became careful around sound, flinching at the wrong moments. He refused invitations to certain parades and reunions, saying he was too busy, when what he meant was that he did not want to stand in a crowd and hear someone cheer the word hero. The result was self-protection. The cost was isolation, because guilt did not like company. In 1985, in a veterans' hall that smelled of burnt coffee and old tobacco, Keller unfolded a newspaper and saw a small notice placed by a German woman looking for an American doctor who had performed emergency abdominal surgery on her during prisoner transfer in May 1945 on a French road. She named the doctor as Morrison, or as close to Morrison as she could spell, and asked for contact through official channels. The result was recognition, like a shock. Too many details matched. The cost was fear, because survival meant she could answer him back. Keller folded the paper and carried it home like contraband. He checked his notebook line, checked the date and checked again, as if a month could slide and let him escape. Then he wrote to the Veterans Office with the notice attached, stating he had been the driver and guard on the transport where Morrison operated. He did not claim credit for saving anyone. He claimed only presence. The result was a request supported by a public trail. The cost was that he placed himself back under the same spotlight he had avoided for decades. This time the reply contained what he had dreaded and needed: a name, Hilda, and a current city, Frankfurt. No address was provided. The office would forward a letter. The result was a narrow bridge. The cost was that Keller had to decide what to send across it, knowing he could not control what came back. He sat at his desk and failed 3 times. "Dear Miss," he stopped, not knowing what name she used now. "To the woman from the truck." He stopped, hearing accusation in his own words. He tried to explain the sergeant's orders and the fear of stopping on a road that still felt hostile, but each explanation sounded like a defense brief. The result was that he recognized his own instinct to shift blame. The cost was that he could no longer tolerate that instinct. On the 4th attempt, he wrote only what he could prove. He had been the driver and guard. He had heard knocking. He had not stopped immediately. Then he wrote, without excuse, "I am sorry. I should have run faster." He signed his name and gave his address as if it were a confession. The result was a letter that did not argue. The cost was that mailing it felt like placing his throat under a blade. For months he listened for the rural carrier, the way he had once listened for tapping. Every day the mail truck's approach made his stomach tighten. When an envelope finally arrived through forwarding channels, Keller held it with both hands before opening it, as if paper could cut. Inside was one sentence in careful English: "You ran. Thank you." The result was an answer that did not punish him. The cost was that gratitude was not the verdict he had rehearsed, and he did not know what to do with mercy that arrived in one line. The winter after the letter, Keller's voice began to fail. At first it was morning rasp, then pain, then blood in the sink one morning that made his wife go quiet. Tests followed. A doctor spoke the word cancer with blunt calm: treatment, surgery, uncertain time. The result was a countdown that shrank every delay he had ever tolerated. The cost was that he saw his 40-year search as both necessary and too late. He told his wife he wanted to call Frankfurt. Letters were slow, and his throat was running out of time. The Veterans Office could arrange it the same way they forwarded mail, protecting privacy through a switchboard and scheduled times. Paperwork and waiting followed, because even a phone call had to pass through procedure. The result was a date circled on a calendar. The cost was that his body weakened while the calendar turned. After surgery, his throat was scarred and words came out broken. He practiced short sentences in the mirror, shaping sounds that would not hold. On the day of the call, his wife sat beside him at the kitchen table and dialed the long sequence. There was a faint delay on the line, the small lag of signals crossing an ocean. A woman answered in English, touched by German vowels. "Hello." Keller forced air through damaged tissue and said his name, barely a whisper. After a pause, she said, gently, "I know." The result was contact made real. The cost was that Keller's prepared sentences dissolved in the presence of her voice. They spoke for 12 minutes. Keller managed 7 short sentences. "I'm sorry. I didn't know your name. I hear it still. I wanted you to know I tried." Between those sentences he listened, to her breathing, to the slight delay that made every response feel like it traveled through time, to the steadiness in her tone. The result was that he finally did the thing he had not done at the start. He stopped and listened fully. The cost was that listening made his own failure vivid, because it proved he could have listened sooner. Hilda did most of the talking, laying out facts like tools. She said her appendix had been close to rupturing. She said she had been sick before capture and hid it out of fear. Fear of being isolated. Fear of being judged weak. Fear that weakness would make her disposable. She said her friend had pounded until her hands bled because she believed the truck would not stop otherwise, and she did not trust captors to care about a prisoner's pain. The result was a second account that fit his own without myth. The cost was the knowledge that his delay mattered, but it had been embedded in a larger machinery of fear and movement. Hilda described the transfer in the only way she could. Military police took custody. There was wire and a registry line. Then another move, and another, along a route built for supplies and repurposed for bodies. Names were misspelled, papers lost, people turned into counts. She said she learned quickly that survival meant being moved, away from the front, toward order, toward some version of safety. The result was explanation for Keller's years of dead ends. The cost was the realization that the same chain that saved her by moving her rearward also made her almost impossible to trace afterward. She spoke briefly of the life that followed: home, marriage, teaching, children, because time and distance did not allow more. She said she still remembered the covered truck and the metal rings and the feeling of being packed with other bodies. And she still remembered the moment the pounding finally produced a stop. The result was proof that the day had not been only Keller's burden. The cost was that Keller understood he had been living with a memory that belonged to someone else too. And he had been alone only because he had kept it that way. Then Hilda said the sentence Keller had feared and wanted. "You did not kill me. You saved me." Keller opened his mouth to object, to insist he had only run a few steps too late, to place the credit back where he believed it belonged, with Morrison and the instruments and the skill. His throat refused full words. The result was silence where he had expected a final declaration. The cost was a missing line he would carry to the end. Hilda did not dramatize his silence. She told him why his letter mattered. Doctors did not need to apologize for fear and delay. Soldiers did, if they wanted to stop hearing the past knock at the present. She said she had looked for Morrison because Morrison was the name she had heard, the only name connected to that day. She said Keller's name had arrived later, attached to an apology, and that apology mattered more than a hero story because it admitted a human cost. The result was that Keller understood his apology had addressed the part of the story medicine could not address. The cost was that he understood how many years it had taken him to learn that truth. When the call ended, the line went dead into a soft tone, and Keller sat motionless, listening as if expecting another sound to follow. His wife touched his arm. Keller took a pen and wrote on a scrap of paper, because writing was the one voice he still had. "She remembers me." The result was a sentence that turned tapping into human recognition. The cost was that recognition did not erase regret. It only gave regret a face. In the months that followed, Keller put his affairs in order with the methodical care of a man who had spent his life fixing what he could. He wrote a will. He told his wife he wanted the marching notebook burned when he died, not because the war was secret, but because he did not want his children building a legend or a condemnation from one thin line. The result was an attempt to control his story one last time. The cost was that the request revealed he still feared judgment, even after Hilda's words. When Keller died in 1988, the funeral was small. His gravestone called him a farmer and listed dates. It did not mention France. His wife did not burn the notebook. She tore out the page with the one line and kept it folded in an envelope, then slid that envelope into his coffin before the lid closed. The result was a compromise between erasure and witness. The cost was that she carried the act as a private decision no one else could validate. Years later, Keller's son found out what she had done. He did not get a full account, only the existence of that page and the fact that it had been preserved like a splinter. Before the Gulf War, he enlisted not for glory, but because he wanted a rule that could survive fear and procedure. When he left, he told his wife, "If anyone knocks, I'm stopping." The result was a bottom line forged from his father's 3 minutes. The cost was that the tapping crossed into another generation's uniform. Keller never met Hilda in person. Oceans and time made sure of that, but the apology crossed anyway, through stamps, procedures, and delays, and arrived while a voice still existed to answer. The result was closure that was imperfect but real. The cost was that Keller would always know the first 3 minutes had been his to spend better, and that knowing was the price of finally stopping to listen.